And we are back. And today we are with Ben Mombert, aka Ben Mombert, as he will be today on the Pursuit of Ownership. Ben is with Columbia Bank. He is the VP of Private and Professional Banking Relationships. And he's going to be telling us a little bit about some of the obstacles that come along with transitions, people trying to get into acquiring a practice. And so I'm going to kind of let him take it away. I've already spoken with him a few times, and he's had some really wonderful insights that were actually somewhat new to me. And so I think it's really going to be great for you guys as well. So, Ben, take it away.
Perfect. No, thank you, Tyler and Clay. Appreciate you guys having me on, and hopefully we can shed some light a little bit on kind of what we see from the buyer side and the bank side for acquisitions, both positive and positive experiences and challenges. So yeah, more than happy to answer any questions or share our experiences and insight that may be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just to start off, what would you say is the number one thing that people that are going into acquisitions don't really anticipate and seems to be a huge obstacle that comes up in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, there's several, I think, reoccurring challenges that we've witnessed, and myself that I've witnessed through the buyers that I've worked with over the last 10 years.
Mhm.
I would say the biggest thing that I've noticed recently is full fee practices or fee for service practices when people are looking to acquire those. Obviously, it's unique in terms of you're not in network, and so typically what we found is those practices have a higher goodwill attached to them. Usually, they're more established. The sellers have owned them for years and years, and you have second, third generation patients still coming to those practices. And so, a lot of times after an acquisition, there is a higher risk for a patient attrition. Um, and so, you can see a little bit of a drop there. And so, the biggest obstacle is getting through that stage. If there is patient attrition, making sure you can either add procedures to the practice, get new patients in the practice to kind of make up for that attrition and lost revenue. Um, the biggest problem we've seen with fee for service practices is typically buyers get bad advice after they acquire the practice,
Mhm.
whether it be from advisors or friends. And they say, hey, you need to go in network. That's what everyone else is doing. That's what your competition is doing. That's the only way to drive new patients to your practice. And obviously, what happens in that case is it's going to reduce your reimbursements pretty substantially, and ultimately, you're going to end up with a practice. Maybe if it was doing 1 million in annual revenue originally, if you go to all in network, you're going to cut your reimbursements by potentially 20-25%, but your overhead doesn't change, and so it's hitting your bottom line
Sure.
directly. And so that's a lot of patients that you're going to have to add to the practice to make up for that lost revenue. um, so that's the biggest challenge that I think we've seen recurring over probably the last handful of years is just the challenge of sticking with the fee for service model when you do see a little patient attrition up front with that type of
Right.
a practice.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting, Ben, because I think to the listeners, it's not that fee for service practices are bad. It's just you have to kind of go in to eyes wide open and understand that there's going to be some patient attrition and not to overcorrect and try to not bite the hand that feeds you, but basically you're changing your whole model on how it
Mhm.
works. What's the typical uh, patient attrition that you see with fee for service practices? Somebody say it's somebody out of school a couple of years, and obviously you mentioned the goodwill portion of that fee for service practice. Most of the people are there for that the other dentist, and he just sold it to you. So how much
Mm-hmm.
patient attrition are you guys typically seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the scenario because, sometimes, if you do get the seller to stay back for maybe 6 months to a year and, get
Mhm.
them through one or two recall cycles and kind of have more of a staggered transition, then you see less of that attrition. But if you have more of a clean break, where the seller, after 2 weeks or right away, steps away from the practice and doesn't assist with that transition, then, you can see, we've seen, 10, 15% attrition right off the top. Again, it depends on every scenario. And every situation is a little bit different, but I typically expect, 10 to 15%, if there's not that strong transition plan, and or if the buyer's not able to maybe add, procedures to the mix of the practice that the seller was referring out or not treatment planning for.
Right. So one thing that I believe we talked about in the past is, different transition styles, how long the seller stays on, if they do stay on at all, how that transition works out. Are there some strategies that you've seen, and especially in situations where it's a walkaway transition, where there have been ways to sort of mitigate the risk of of patient attrition? Are there ways to sort of advertise that, a new buyer is coming on, and perhaps a less intimidating way to patients? Are there any ways to kind of soften that blow that you've seen?
I think getting, certainly the staff's buy-in right away,
Sure.
is a big key. Because frankly, from a patient's perspective, I think, ultimately why they do, trust and want to see their provider, their dentist, they also have a extremely good relationship with their hygienist, the front office, assistants, the folks that may have been there for a long time. So I think a big key, if there is going to be a walkaway transition, is making sure you get that staff on board to really support you and help you, with your treatment planning and getting the buy-in of the patients. A lot of times, we even recommend, if it's possible, to have a conversation, weeks before closing, an introduction to that staff. So it kind of gets them used to the idea, and you can, make sure that you're going to get everybody to stay on board. Because it's a big, shock to their system a lot of times if they're not aware that the practice is going to transition. So that to me is, what we've seen is a big key, almost just as much as, the seller transitioning the practice.
Yeah, I think the staff issues are very important because, especially in the FFS arena, much of what you're buying into is that goodwill, and much of what the patients value are the faces that they're used to seeing. And, if you come in and the staff is perhaps not terribly fond of you, and they're not totally buying into what you're putting on the table, you kind of run a risk if you're to try and replace someone. That's essentially part of what you paid for. So that's kind of that's sort of a balance that you have to have in trying to have a staff that has buy-in to you, but also trying to preserve what the patients are so used to. And that's definitely something people should be aware of. And it seems to me like that's a more sensitive issue with regards to FFS than, something that, has an insurance base.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say too is really digging into a little bit the personality of the seller, how you relate. Are you similar, from a personality standpoint? Does he spend 5-10 minutes with every patient? Is he in and out of there? So at least in the first year or two, you can kind of replicate what he's providing in terms of a patient, he or she is providing in terms of a patient experience. Because fee-for-service offices, sometimes you see, a coffee bar and the dentist will spend more time with their patients. Those patients may be more particular in terms of what their experience is. And so you want to, make sure you understand that and hopefully replicate that as well.
Now, Ben, from a lending perspective or a financing perspective, are you guys looking at these fee-for-service practices differently than, say, like a PPO practice? Do you have different risk tolerance for either one of those? Or are they different in the bank size?
Yeah, I mean, from our experience, I would say when we see a full fee or fee-for-service practice, we evaluate it as being a little riskier with an acquisition, just because we know, just based on experience, we know time and time again we've seen either some attrition, after an acquisition, or again buyers get a little bit spooked, get bad advice, and start adding in-network plans and really cutting into their own profitability. In addition, it's hard to replace those new patients, from what I've been told from some of our clients, because when a patient calls in and says, hey, I'd like to see if you have any appointments, are you in network with my insurance plan? If the staff isn't trained on how to answer that question, it can be hard to add new patients. So that's another challenge that we found is, not only can you experience some patient attrition, but if your staff isn't trained on really how to answer that question, and what separates your office compared to the typical run-of-the-mill PPO office, then it's going to be hard to add new patients as well.
Right. And I think that one thing you were kind of talking about earlier was, when patients notice a discrepancy in, what the buyer is like versus what the seller is like, when they're talking to them, oftentimes FFS dentists will spend a lot of time with their patients and they'll talk to them. Do you hear much about, buyers come in and there's like a huge discrepancy in terms of, say, diagnostics? Maybe the seller dentist was more conservative, or they were, more aggressive in treatment. Have you found that buyers will see that sort of tension when there's sort of a difference in those treatment philosophies? Are patients able to sense that?
Yeah, I think certainly if a seller's more conservative in their treatment planning, certainly if a buyer comes in and is a little more aggressive, maybe add some new technology and equipment to the practice.
I've heard in some situations, a buyer will come into this situation and perhaps the buyer and the seller did maybe have some discrepancies between, how they diagnose certain things. And I can imagine it especially happens in a fee-for-service situation. But do patients sort of sense a discrepancy in terms of, being aggressive about crowns or, what to watch, what not to watch? Do you ever find that can cause some tension, and does that maybe lead to attrition in some situations?
Yeah, I think we've heard some feedback from a few of our clients that have suggested, if the seller's extremely conservative, if a new buyer comes in and maybe is a little more aggressive in the treatment planning, that it may turn some patients off and they may lose some patients. But typically, you will still get some patients to accept treatment, and it typically will, the new production that you're doing that seller is referring out or not treatment planning for, that will typically make up for any attrition. I think the bigger issue is typically when it's the other way around, where the seller is more aggressive and the buyer is more conservative.
Really?
Yeah, typically that's when we see a bigger issue in terms of, kind of going forward, and a potential drop in revenues is because all of a sudden, there's going to be less production, more so on the operative side, obviously, done at the practice. And so you see that initial drop right away. Hopefully that's not the case with a maybe more established older dentist that, you'd expect at a fee-for-service office. But it can be the case with other offices. And frankly, that was kind of one of the ones on my list that I thought I'd bring up is one of the things that we've seen is, with acquisitions, and it's hard from the bank's perspective, obviously, to evaluate the clinical aspect of the practice, and that's really what we're counting our buyers to do. But from time to time, we'll see practices show really good revenue trends leading up to an acquisition, really good cash flow, and typically, that's a great thing and something that we like to see. However, if you start digging a little further, sometimes you see that growth being led by, really an increase in crowns, and, new patients are really staying kind of stagnant, and hygiene, income production is staying stagnant. And so we've seen a few times where practices, are really aggressively treated by the seller, boost up income for them, boost up their sales price, and then the buyer pays for it after the acquisition. So that's been something that we've seen probably a handful of times in the past few years.
So it kind of sounds like the onus is kind of on the buyer, really, to do their due diligence and kind of figure out what's going on peel back the curtain, so to speak, and maybe that's more in the due diligence process of the whole acquisition.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we've learned and had these experiences, when we do see kind of trends like that, because we typically like to see production reports, production by procedure reports to kind of validate, hey, what does, the percentage of crowns and hygiene and everything look like? Because if the hygiene's, 15%, that's always an indicator to me that, hey, this practice is either being overtreated, and or maybe you have a super producer dentist that's like doing everything under the sun. And if so, does that buyer have the clinical skill set to match that? So we do ask those questions, but yes, I mean, I would say, as the buyer, you really, like you said, got to peel back the onion to look at production reports. Go in, look at, at least 10% of the charts, look at the software, look at x-rays, and make sure you really understand the practice from a clinical perspective, because not only, could the seller be treatment planning differently than you, but, you want to make sure clinically they're a good dentist, because you don't want a bunch of redos after the fact and have to deal with that, because that's always a challenge as well.
When we were helping people out with just sort of informal evaluations of practices, one surrogate indicator that we used was our big filling to crown ratio. So we would always take the procedure by ADA code report and sort of look at, our idea is that you have a situation where you could do a big filling on a tooth versus doing a crown. And if you look at all those situations compared side by side, you get sort of a ratio. And then, over time, we sort of developed a spectrum of, this is sort of an indicator of perhaps how aggressive someone is in a similar diagnostic situation. That's one way that we would, kind of look at those things. And now that we have, practice by numbers, and we can take practice snapshots and stuff and look at all kinds of different metrics, we can have a more sophisticated analysis. But that's definitely something that we always try to look for, the hygiene percentage being probably even more important as well. So I think that definitely reinforces some of the things that we've been, trying to harp on. So yeah, it's really good to hear that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Ben, so let's say I'm a dentist that is out a couple of years. I worked in a practice that I'm not going to buy, but I want to be in the area, and I found a practice that I do want to buy. When's the right time to contact a bank?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because I think the common answer is, typically banks want to see 2 years when you're talking about conventional financing. And that can be, we're talking about 2 years clinical, so that could be a residency, 1 year residency, and 1 year out of school working at a private practice. The big mitigate to that is, if you're working at the practice you're buying, our bank and typically a lot of other banks that do dental financing can get their heads around that a little more. So if you've worked at the practice that you're buying 6 months or a year, it really limits that transition that typically comes with an acquisition, because, you've already been introduced to patients, the operation, the staff, that's really out of the way. So I would say if you're looking to buy a practice really, early out of school, if you can find a practice that you want to buy, kind of get an agreement in place with the seller that, hey, after a year or 2 years, I'd like to buy this practice. That's something that banks will be willing typically to finance conventionally for a younger doctor right out of school. But yeah, to your point, 2 years is typically the answer for conventional financing. Unless there's some major mitigation, whether that be, potentially another guarantor on the loan, maybe the seller carries some of the financing in addition to the bank. Maybe the seller is willing to sign a contract and stay for a year, assuming that the practice is big enough to support, maybe 1.5 providers to 2 providers. So some of those things kind of help mitigate, a younger dentist, buying a practice right out of school.
So what are some things that you guys are that the banks would be looking at buyers? Are there kind of a checklist of things that buyers have to kind of meet minimally to kind of get you guys to be interested, basically?
Sure. And from a bank's perspective, we look at 2 different things. Number one being the practice, which frankly probably holds a little more weight, because, we're number one looking at the cash flow. What at the end of the day, what's the owner cash flow look like? Is that going to be sufficient to be able to pay back not only the business loan, but any personal obligations, taxes, and create a more than sufficient cushion at the end of the day that even if there is a bump in the economy or a little bit of attrition after the acquisition, that, that's not going to create an issue type of deal. Other things we look at is the transition plan. Certainly, we've financed enough acquisitions to know that that typically does make a difference with maintaining that goodwill that you're purchasing from the seller. So if you can get a bit of a transition plan to get their support and introduction to patients, that certainly does help, along with obviously maintaining that staff and cohesiveness at the practice. We want to look at from the practice side of things, what's the condition and improvement of the equipment and the overall space. Is it something that it's good quality equipment that's not going to have to be replaced in the next several years, or is it something that you're going to have to make some dramatic improvements and investment in to get it to a point where you're comfortable clinically? So that's a big key. Certainly there's a lot of aspects of a practice that we look at, that success factors that drive, kind of our lending decision. But on the buyer side, as you mentioned, really, experience is the biggest thing for us. Evaluating, clinically, can the buyer replicate what the seller's doing? Can they handle the procedure mix that the seller's doing? Do they have the hand speed to maintain, that practice? And some more subjective pieces that, are harder to measure is the buyer's business acumen. Have they done the due diligence of the practice? Do they have some management experience? Have they really dug into the location? Have they, done a chart out on the practice? Those things, while it's subjective, make a big deal to the bank because, if you have a business plan going in, it makes us feel so much more comfortable lending money because we know that, hey, this isn't, something that you're, taking lightly. You're taking this seriously. You have a plan for the practice, and you're probably the type of person that if you do get in a situation where you see some attrition, you have the, knowledge and ability to be able to deal with that and grow the practice back up to where it needs to be and make it work. And then, of course, we look at the personal financial statement of the buyer. So, assets and liabilities. A lot of banks in the industry will look for the buyer to have liquidity in the bank, maybe a certain percentage, whether it be 5 or 10% of the loan amount. Some banks don't. We don't have a liquidity requirement, but
interesting.
It never hurts. Certainly because, it just gives you a little more confidence that if you do run into a bit of a bump, you have some, excess capital to, fund things and make things work.
So I'm glad
I think.
No, sorry. Go ahead, Tyler.
So I was just going to say that I think these things begin to become a lot more intuitive when you just consider things from your side, from the banker's side. Mm-hmm. If I were going to invest in someone's ability to be successful in dental practice, what would make me feel safer about giving that money to someone? I would want someone with some experience. I would want someone with some cash in the bank going into it, someone with, management experience, someone that's good with people, someone that walks through the door with a pro forma and has like a really good idea of what this is going to look like when I go into transition. I think things, when you think of it from the other perspective, become a lot simpler. Yeah.
And another subjective thing is personality. I mean, if you can come across that, you can relate to people and have a personality, that makes a big difference as well because, dentistry is a people person business, whether it's dealing with patients and getting their treatment acceptance or dealing with staff or whoever it might be. And so, that's a big piece and that drives success a lot of times too.
You mentioned,
so if I walked in your office with like a dentiform and showed you like a crown prep or something, you would not be very impressed.
Well, frankly, as a patient, I don't know the difference between a good dentist and a bad dentist, and so if you know how to sell me on treatment, that's almost more important.
Okay. Sorry, Clay, I keep cutting you off.
No, it's all right. No, Ben, you mentioned about, because I think a lot of people think about this when they get out of middle school and, okay, I work for 2 years and finally I'm making money, but I have all these student loans. So
Mhm.
how does a bank look at student loans? I know you mentioned liquidity, but how am I supposed to save up all this money if I'm supposed to pay down all these loans? So is
Yeah.
there a,
So,
yeah, sorry, go ahead. I'll let you answer.
oh yeah, no problem. I mean, obviously, we know, and you guys know, student loans are growing more and more, especially among the dental industry, and so it's not uncommon, especially for specialists like orthodontists, for us to see folks that have student loan balances in excess of $700,000 as they come out of school, and you know, while it's not exciting for us to see someone with a negative, $500,000 net worth
Yeah.
apply for $1 million loan, we understand that it's part of the deal. I mean, you have to get your education. That debt is not necessarily bad debt. It's not revolving debt. It's not a line of credit. It's something that basically is allowing you to move on to the next, your career and earn a good living. And so while it's not exciting to see those big balances, it's not something that's going to create an issue typically for financing, because there's so many options out there now for student loan repayment in terms of, income-based repayment, pay-as-you-go type plans, that really it's
Mhm.
about what your obligation is going to be, and if it's reasonable long term, and is there enough cash flow generated by the business to support both the business obligations and obviously your student loan obligations.
So something too, Ben, is that I see is that people say, okay, I have all this student loan, I need to pay it off. Would you rather see liquidity? Like, so say somebody has $200,000 of student loan debt. Would you rather have them 50K in the bank with $200,000 of student loans, or, you know, $150,000 of student loans and no liquidity? Like, which one looks better from a banking and a lending perspective? If that I've done my job, I've paid down my loans, but I don't have any money for that cushion, like you mentioned. Uh, or hey, I know that my student loans are building. I'm on an income based repayment program, but look at all this liquidity. Which one looks better in the bank size?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, from our perspective, we're comfortable with both. Certainly it's nice to see that you have liquidity in the bank. But at the same time, it's also nice to see someone that is debt adverse and is being responsible about their obligations. And there's so many people now that are, letting that income-based repayment plan just go, and it grows and grows and grows every year. And they start with 500,000 in balances, and 10 years later, they have $800,000 in balances, and it just keeps growing. So, I mean, I think either way we can get there, and it's not a bad thing to show the bank that you're responsible and debt averse, and willing to, reduce your obligations. I would say as long as you don't have a material portion of revolving debt, credit card debt, that's
Right.
the big key. Because if
Gotcha.
you have, let's say, 5,000, 10,000 in the bank and no credit card revolving debt, that's fine. And you've been responsible in paying down your student loans. But if you've got 5,000, 10,000 in the bank, but have $30,000 in credit card debt, that kind of shows you're not
Consumer debt.
living
Yeah.
within your means, and you're kind of using credit cards to float your lifestyle.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to kind of change gears just a little bit. I guess I'm backpedaling really. So we talked about some issues that happen with FFS transitions.
Mm-hmm.
As far as PPO transitions, what are some obstacles that you encounter with that? And maybe it's not patient attrition, but what else could it be? What other problems?
Yeah, in addition to like sellers over treating, which comes up from time to time, I would say one of the other big items that we've seen become a problem after an acquisition is when a buyer is purchasing one of multiple locations from a seller. So let's say the seller owns 3 locations, they're selling one of those 3 and keeping the other 2. Um, that has been challenging at times, and we honestly have a tough time financing those just because of our experience in the past. But typically, you see those financials consolidated, and then the brokers will put together kind of almost like a pro forma cash flow instead of an actual cash flow, and they'll break down the overhead based on percentage of production at each location, which maybe works in a theoretical world, but in the real world, we know that every practice is run separately, has a different procedure mix, which is driving supplies and lab, has different staff needs, and the overhead's going to be different per office. And so it's really hard in those cases to really get comfortable with what the true owner cash flow is going to be at the end of the day. And so that's one of the challenges. The other challenge, frankly, is even if those other two or other practice fall outside of the non-compete area, patients seem to find their way to that seller after the acquisition. And frankly, they don't have to solicit them. They may not be soliciting them, but they hear through the grapevine that seller's practicing, 15 miles down the road, and you end up losing some of those patients. And it's happened before, unfortunately. And then the other piece is certainly you may have staff that is, cross between the two locations, maybe an office manager that's, working between multiple locations, or hygienists that are floating between, and you end up losing some of that expertise and experience and staffing. So it sounds like you guys may have seen this before based on your reaction.
Yeah, it just seems really messy.
Yeah. It does. Yeah. I don't know that we've seen a whole lot of situations where people bought over one practice out of many, but a lot of those issues do sound like they could get kind of grimy. I think for the most part, I'm just sort of imagining what that sort of transition would look like.
Yeah, not pleasant.
It's not typically. Yeah. Another item that has come up with PPO practices, as you mentioned, is Delta Dental Premier only practices. And really on the West Coast, we're seeing it more, but it's starting to spread throughout the country, where I think it started in California, where Delta started pushing the Premier-only practices when they transitioned to a new owner. They basically wouldn't let the owner get credentialed as a Premier-only provider, and they had to start accepting basically, the PPO plan, which reduced their fees by 20 to 25%. And brokers and sellers will try to, explain it away as, hey, but I'm referring out this, and the buyer's going to be able to add that, and it's just going to be a wash. Well, that's not the case. I mean, that's just not reality, unfortunately. And so for us, when we see Delta Dental in the practice, we typically ask, hey, how much of the patient base is from Delta Dental? And we find out, is the practice a Premier-only provider? If so, we've even gone to the extent of calling Delta Dental with the buyer and validating, hey, is this something they're going to be able to maintain in terms of the fee schedule after they acquire the practice? And we have had some success with that in certain states, and kind of getting them, at least verbally or by email, to confirm that, because certainly it's a pretty substantial chunk if you're doing 50+% delta, and you're going to lose that.
Right. That could mean buying the practice or not, right? I mean, you could 20 to 25%. That's a huge deal, especially with cash flow with a PPO practice.
Yeah, because your overhead is going to stay the same. It just hits right to your bottom line. So there's really no way to make up for that typically.
Right. And if your idea is that you're going to compensate for it, with added procedures and, just producing more and such, I mean, you're starting from behind right off the bat. And I feel like that's just sort of getting married to an opportunity and not, being able to see the forest for the trees. So,
and frankly, you shouldn't have to pay for something that you're going to be adding to the practice. If you're going to be adding procedures to the practice, growing the practice, you shouldn't have to pay for that. That should be something that, gets added based on your growth and hard work.
Yeah. So in terms of credentialing more in a general sense, are there any other obstacles related to, if it's Medicaid, if it's Delta, if it's, just the seller, the buyer getting credentialed in the insurances that the selling doctor offers? Is that an obstacle in itself?
Yeah, I would say, Medicaid offices are a big red flag in themselves. If you're buying or looking at buying a majority Medicaid office, number one, credentialing is a big deal. From state to state, it can be different depending on who's administering the Medicaid in that state. But for example, in Texas, MCNA requires that you have an executed bill of sale before you can even start the credentialing process, and it can take 90 plus days to get credentialed. And so if your practice is doing a lot of, MCNA patients and you can't bill or collect for 90 plus days, that can substantially affect your cash flow.
Yeah.
And no matter how much working capital the bank provides you, you're going to have a shortfall at some point. And we've run into that a few times. So we've learned from experience to kind of ask further questions and really dig into truly how long that process is going to take and how easy it is to get credentialed, and making sure that we have, enough operating capital between what the bank's providing and the buyer has to make that work.
Right. So when in the acquisition process should that conversation generally come up?
I would say as early as possible.
Okay.
As soon as probably the LOI is executed and both parties are working in good faith to work towards closing, I'd say let's get started on figuring out what the credential process is going to be and work towards that, because I think the solution has been in the past, whether it's PPO or Medicaid, that hey, we'll go ahead and bill under the seller's number and it'll all be okay. But if the seller decides they're unwilling to do that after an acquisition, the buyer's stuck.
Tough luck.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty critical to really understand that piece. The other piece with Medicaid offices that I think is important to note is if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. Okay. Frankly, if the cash flow looks like a low overhead PPO or fee for service office, I'd be concerned about potential fraud by the seller, boosting up that practice. And we've seen that, a handful of times as well. And I think, if you dig into, articles and stuff, there was a lot of abuse of different Medicaid programs in Texas, for example, through ortho, and throughout the country, really, because I just think there's a lack of oversight typically with Medicaid. Right. And what an insurance company would probably push back on in terms of paying stuff that's not necessarily being caught up front, and then the buyer can end up having a problem after the fact if obviously they're not willing to risk their license and commit fraud and continue some of those things that the seller was doing.
Yeah, I think it's probably every 3 or 4 months I see the story of the Alaska dentist that had billed out like a third of the sedation billing for Medicaid in Alaska. Like that story's been going around for years, and I think it's the same guy that did an extraction on a hoverboard or something.
That's what I was going to ask. The hoverboard guy. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. We've heard about him. Yeah, that's floated around for a while now.
He's famous.
Yeah, so that's the kind of thing you got to look out for in Medicaid offices. Hoverboards. That's what hoverboards.
Yeah.
So now, Ben, as far as buying the practice, sometimes the case comes up where I could also buy the real estate with the practice. Can you kind of talk about, is a bank willing to give me even more debt after we already have these student loans? I'm buying this huge practice, and now I can buy a building too and be a commercial landlord. Like, is this real life?
Yeah. I mean, frankly, it really comes down to cash flow, and the real estate's going to provide some hard, tangible collateral that certainly a practice doesn't always provide. And so, from a collateral perspective, banks will feel a little more comfortable a lot of times with the real estate, especially traditional C&I lenders. They're used to tangible, hard collateral. Real estate is that, obviously, with a practice. Majority of what banks are financing is an airball, is goodwill. So, so as long as it's owner occupied, If it was a building that, let's say, the practice only occupied, 33% of that space, that's a little more challenging because then it falls in the realm of a non-owner occupied property. And a lot of banks aren't interested in that type of property in terms of the financing end of things. So that becomes a little more challenging. But if it's 51% or more owner occupied, then typically, as long as the cash flow is supportive, us and many other dental lenders throughout the country are going to be able to, provide financing at the time of the acquisition of the practice. The only thing to note is typically there's a loan to value issue in terms of banks will typically only lend up to about 80% on the building. So there's a 20% down payment requirement.
Oh, wow.
So how that can be funded is potentially through a seller note. So if the seller is willing to carry that 20% and be subordinate to the bank, then that works in terms of basically the quasi down payment to get us there. So it doesn't have to come from the buyer.
Subordinate to the bank means the bank gets paid first before that sell, before the seller.
Yeah, and there's actually, exactly. So it's subordinate to the bank in terms of the payment and subordinate to the bank in terms of the lien position. So the seller basically is in second position until the bank gets paid, and then they get whatever's left over.
Do you find that most sellers are willing to do that? Because you guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but the practice, you guys can, it can be, if the cash flow is correct and everything checks out, but 100% of the purchase price plus working capital. Whereas the building, it's not the same. You got to have 20% down for that.
Yeah, I mean, typically, if the seller's interested in selling the building at the time of the acquisition of the practice, there's not a lot of options. If the buyer, if typical buyers aren't going to have 20% down, I mean, I think that's going to be probably a select few buyers that are going to have that availability and or willingness to put that much down at the time of an acquisition. And so, if they're interested in selling the practice, then typically they will be comfortable carrying that 20%. I mean, it's not a significant portion. Typically, if they're getting paid 100% for the practice and then 80% for the real estate, they're still getting a pretty, big check at the end of the day, and carrying that 20% is typically not too big of a deal. And we can even put, balloon payments over potentially 3 or 5 years. So, they can hopefully get repaid after that 3 or 5 year period after that note comes due.
Sure. And so how often, to sort of circle back on seller financing, how often are you seeing that being a part of acquisitions?
I mean, it really comes down to, is the seller financing going to help, the bank get comfortable in terms of, a transition? Because if the seller has some skin in the game, we found there's a higher likelihood for them to live up to whatever, transition plan they've kind of committed to. If they're going to carry, 10 or 20% of the note, they're probably more likely to stick around and be more concerned with the success of the buyer. So in the situations potentially where, we have a younger buyer that we want a longer transition with, then that could be a consideration, is to have a seller carry to kind of help, enforce that. In addition, potentially if the purchase price goes kind of above and beyond what the bank is comfortable with from a loan to revenue perspective, it's a way for the bank to basically, keep, our loan balance kind of where we're comfortable. The cash flow obviously works because we wouldn't do the deal if the cash flow didn't support both our debt and the seller's debt. But it's just, from a loan to revenue perspective, it may be above the benchmark of that bank that's, kind of creating the issue. So those are some circumstances that obviously a seller note can help. If it's a cash flow issue, then a seller note's really not going to fix the cash flow issue because, no matter how little the loan is on the bank side, if the cash flow doesn't work, potentially you have a problem.
Yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
that should give pause to any buyers that if the bank's not willing to loan you the money because it doesn't cash flow, I don't know if I would want to buy the practice, right? So it's not
they might be out of something. Yeah.
It's not the bank's fault. They're usually pretty smart about the money side of things.
Right. So another thing that we've been talking about a good bit, especially in terms of acquiring practices, is we kind of have this dichotomy between, do you want to be a group practice owner? That is to say that, you're operating a practice that has, more than one provider. More often than not, it's going to be two providers, two hygienists, two front desk, two assistants, something like that, versus being a solo provider. So
Mm-hmm.
on you guys' end, I mean, I know that cash flow is everything, but are there any nuances between evaluating a practice when someone's looking to buy into or take over a larger group versus a solo practice?
I think where it comes down to is if it's a group practice, if you're acquiring it at the time, if let's say it's a $2.5 million revenue practice,
Yes.
are you going to have a committed seller and or associate to stick back and continue to work? Certainly that's bigger than a solo practice. So if you did have turnover, how easy is it to, maintain another provider? Are you in a metro area where you can, easily, hire somebody, or is it in a rural area where it's a little bit harder to find another provider quickly? So, I think it depends on the situation. Certainly, for us, the loan amount doesn't necessarily scare us, or the size of the practice, because frankly, they cash flow better typically, because you get better economies of scale,
Of course.
because you've got a lot of fixed costs and or variable costs that you can really squeeze a little bit and get some better profitability out of. So really just comes down to, can that buyer maintain that practice, and do you have a commitment from whether it be an associate and or the seller to continue to work long term, and or if they leave, can you do you have enough notice period to be able to replace them, and do you have enough resources within that market to be able to replace them quickly?
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So I think we've covered quite a good breadth of material here and gotten definitely granular with a few different topics. So I think one good way to kind of wrap all this up is, when someone that is looking to buy a practice comes to you, what are the things that you want to hear come out of their mouth? What impresses you about them? What is a good presentation for someone that is looking to buy a practice that comes to you and says, "Hey, I need your help"?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, somebody that's proactively done their due diligence, and maybe not has a actual business plan in hand, but has an idea of really, what their ideal practice is, and does the practice they're looking at fit what their ideal practice is? Because frankly, I think us in the industry get so caught up on, are we getting a good deal on this practice, and really that should be
Sure.
really far down the list of what we're looking for. It should be, does this fit my clinical abilities? Is this where I want to live? Is this how I want to practice? Does the personality of the seller kind of match mine? I mean, everything else about the practice should, obviously the cash flow being a ginormous factor too, because you want to make sure it's going to produce a big enough return for it to make sense, and really, fit your financial goals as well. But, I think, again, somebody coming and coming to me and saying, hey, I've looked at the production reports. I've met with the seller multiple times. I've done a demographics search on the area. I've looked at the
Sure.
competition in the area. I've driven around and looked at the other practices in the area. Somebody that's really done a lot of that diligence really makes me feel a lot more confident in terms of their ability to manage that practice and be successful.
I think what's really beautiful is the parallelism between all that you just said and the things that we really harp on people to do, not just because, these things will make you less risky to a banker, but also because knowing all those things ahead of time is ultimately going to make you happier in this
Mm-hmm.
opportunity. Right. And it's just funny because the two goals are totally copacetic. Like, we want you to be happy in this practice, and a banker wants you to be less risky, but the two actually look very similar. You're in the practice that you were envisioning. You're living the life you wanted to live. You're where you wanted to be. It's servicing the lifestyle that you were hoping to have. And
Yep.
so I think that really brings things full circle. Clay, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, when you were saying all that stuff, Ben, I was like, oh man, that's exactly what shared practices tries to get people to
It's like he's
to do. It's just like,
listening.
oh man, but it's true. I think it makes sense from both ends. Like, I think you have
Yeah.
to know what you're getting into by doing all that due diligence, and that makes you less risky, and just it just makes sense that you know what you're getting into. The bank sees that, and if it cash flows well, you chose the right practice. You know what you want clinically. Your mindset's clear. You have clarity on your vision. I mean, I think it all just, like you said, comes full circle.
Yeah,
great.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Ben, it has been an absolute pleasure. If you would be amenable to it, if someone wanted to reach out to you, if they had some questions about some things you said on the show, I mean, we'll certainly address them ourselves, but if they wanted to speak directly to you, would that be something you'd be able to facilitate? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're always here, to provide, whatever help we can, whether we're going to be the lender or not. I mean, I think it's just good business to be able to, provide whatever insight we can from the banker's perspective. So, if someone has a question about, financing or looking at acquisition from the bank's perspective, more than happy to talk through it and be a resource.
all right. Well, that's awesome. We really appreciate it. So, Ben Mombert, thank you so much for your time. We went over some really, I'm kidding. It's Mombert, but this is TPO. But yeah, again, thank you so much, Ben. And we hope to have you back on sometime in the future. We might be able to pick your brain about some more high level stuff.
Great. Well, I appreciate it, guys. Let me know if I can be of assistance at any time. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you.